So yes, indeed, I'm going to talk about ethics and specifically approaches for the ethical assessment of emerging technologies. And when you're dealing with emerging technologies, you are already dealing with the future, because emerging technologies, they are still in development, so we don't know yet what all the products are going to be, what all the applications are going to be, and what all the impacts are going to be. So that's why I've always argued that foresight is needed for ethics of emerging technologies. But let me first tell you a bit about, and this is especially important since the turn of the century, we have been feeling this explosion of new emerging technologies that are promising to change and disrupt society, what I call emerging socially disruptive technologies. And these are, of course, AI, but it's not only AI, it's robotics, it's Internet of Things, it's newer technology, new sustainable technologies, next generation human genomics, and many others. So, what is a characteristic of many of the technologies is not only that they're changing society as much, but that they're also creating new risks, and especially new ethical risks. Risks that have to do with possible harm, and that have to do with our rights and our values. So that's what I want to focus on. So let's consider some of these ethical risks associated with these technologies. There is, of course, a constant worry about the erosion of privacy and technologies being used for surveillance. Technologies can cause environmental degradation, climate change. Some of these technologies, digital technologies, can contain algorithmic biases and can lead to discriminatory practices. Digital technologies can also manipulate people and make them lose their autonomy. Then it's also important whether people have access to the benefits of these technologies, and that may be unequally distributed, so that could also lead to social inequalities. And some of these technologies, they're very personal. They change our minds, they change our bodies, and make us worry about possible loss of human identity. Think, for example, like about newer technologies like Neuralink, or genetic technologies that may change our genome, enhancement technologies that give us superpowers. That's all in the works nowadays. So will we still be human beings? So plenty of ethical risks to worry about, and this is something not only to be worried about by the average person, it's also something that I will argue that governments should worry about and that businesses should worry about. So why is that? Because they can harm what they are and are trying to achieve. So let me give first an example of how governments might be affected, and then several examples of how businesses might be affected by these ethical risks. So, first example is actually from my own country, the Netherlands, where the Dutch child benefits scandal toppled the government in 2021. So this was actually the result of the use of technology, an automated fraud detection system used by child benefit services. They distribute money for people that need money for having children, often poor families. But it turned out that the agency was using a biased algorithm, fraud detection algorithm, that falsely targeted low-income and immigrant families. What this resulted in is that tens of thousands of families were wrongly penalized. They got no subsidies and got into a lot of problems. And when this came to light, the government actually resigned over this in 2021. And even more so, this big scandal was a big driver of populism in the 2023 elections. There was even one party that got almost 15% of the vote that explicitly ran on the child benefits scandal. So just one biased algorithm, and the government fell, and you got the rise of new populist politics. So then we have another example. You got a social robotics company called Jibo. They went under, unfortunately for them. They developed social companion robots for children and the elderly. And they did so, however, without adequate safeguards to prevent emotional dependency, either by children or the elderly, or to protect privacy, or to guarantee long-term reliability. And as a result, there was a loss of trust because of this ethical misalignment of the technology with people's values and needs and expectations, and the company eventually had to shut down. One more example, not a company that has shut down yet, but that has been in the news a lot, TikTok. They, of course, are a social media app company. Social media uses behavioral AI and algorithmic curation. But TikTok has a lot of problems. They've been accused of misusing data, of proliferating harmful content, of opaque moderation practices, and, of course, government access to data. And as a result of this, it has been banned in many countries on government devices, US, EU, India, and others. There's a possible nationwide ban impending in the United States, and there are also kinds of regulatory investigations, also leading to severe reputational risk. So just one other example of how not worrying about ethical risks might harm a company. Also, the same is true for companies whose products cause large-scale environmental harm. Here's some examples for Kimur, Monsanto Bayer. So this is the chemical industry. They do things like producing toxic pollution, PFAS, glyphosate, other harmful substances, which leads to environmental degradation, health issues, and people rally against this, right? So there's a lot of protests, there are a lot of inquiries, again, reputational risk and harm to the companies as a result. So, some lessons of why to take ethical risks seriously for both governments and companies. So with that in mind, let us consider how such ethical risks may be identified and mitigated. So there's different motives here for companies and for businesses, the two stakeholders I'm looking at most. For governments, their job basically is the public good, right? They work for us, they work for the people. They need to do what's good for us. So for governments, emerging technologies should raise the question, how can we help ensure that these new technologies will not cause harm? Whether environmental harm, health harm, harm to fundamental rights like privacy and freedom, all kinds of harm. Ensuring that these technologies respect our rights and ensuring that they align with public values and legal frameworks. That should be the job of government in their technology policy. For companies, there's also something at stake. They need to function well, they need to build and maintain public trust. They want to avoid reputational and regulatory risks. And they want to ensure that their innovations are market ready and accepted by users and stakeholders. Now, the best way to do these things is to ensure that ethical risks associated with their innovations are mitigated. So again, reasons to take this seriously. So given this proliferation of ethical risk with all these new emerging socially disruptive technologies since the turn of the century, and then the need for both businesses and companies to confront them, it's important then to have approaches to ethics of innovation that can help these stakeholders recognize and mitigate these ethical risks. So what do we need specifically? We need two types of approaches. The first is ethical assessment, that is knowing what the ethical risks are. And ethical assessment is about identifying and evaluating potential ethical issues, risks, and impacts associated with emerging technologies. And then there is ethical guidance, which is about how to deal with these ethical risks once we know them. It's a presentation of normative recommendations or principles to help steer decision-making and practice towards responsible outcomes. So that's what we need. We didn't have that at the turn of the century. We didn't have good tools for that. We had no good ethical assessment tools and no good ethical guidance tools, I want to say, by the turn of the century. What we did have were things that weren't without value or without merit, but weren't as good as could be. We had things like codes of conduct, ethical checklists, ethical guidelines, principle-based ethics review, where you have a number of ethical principles like beneficence or justice, and then you use those principles to review the ethical issues. You had legal ethical compliance procedures. It's more legal than ethical often, so how to conform to the law, that where does ethics then come in? You had guidance from research ethics committees. Well, they sometimes did good work, but sometimes these recommendations were maybe too general to be followed, or ad hoc consultation of ethics experts, all somewhat helpful, but not exactly what we need to do the job well. So that's where my main topic for today comes in, ethical impact assessment, which is especially an approach for ethical assessment. It's also a step towards ethical guidance. I'll talk about that a bit later. But I want to go into detail about the emergence of this approach, ethical impact assessment, and what it can do. And it's an approach that I've been centrally involved with co-developing. I was just talking to Tony Alquist, who was also one of the partners in this approach. We developed it over several years. So ethical impact assessment was developed over a 7-year period. It was sponsored by several projects funded by the European Commission between 2014 and 2021. It's an approach that's supported and used by the European Commission. It's also used by UNESCO, especially applied to their guidelines for ethical AI. So it's an approach that has already gained some attention with policymakers as well as with scholars. And it's an approach that has several benefits compared to these earlier approaches. First of all, and importantly for the conference here, it's anticipatory. That is, it's capable of anticipating possible technological futures and then the associated ethical risks. So it looks at because it's emerging technologies, it looks a lot at the future, what kind of products will be developed, possibly developed in the future, what can we expect in terms of application domains, what could be the various social, economic, environmental impacts, and then the associated ethical risks. It's an approach that covers the whole technology life cycle, so it doesn't look just at a particular product, it also looks at the supply chain, it looks at disposal, it looks at all the ethical risks associated with different phases of the technology life cycle. It employs a structured methodology, it involves methods with a systematic identification, evaluation and mitigation of ethical risks through defined steps, and it's integrated with technology governance. That is, it can systematically inform policy decisions and design choices and oversight mechanisms throughout the life cycle of the technology. So, here's a quick shot. I'm looking at the wrong. Sorry about that. So I was just, yeah, the benefits are right here. Let me give you another second to remember. So those are good promises, but how does the approach actually work? Well, we have a 6-step approach. Quite simply, you first need to know what you're talking about, so you specify your subject, your aim of your investigation, the scope of analysis. Then a lot of attention goes to this description of the subject, so the technology you're investigating, you have to know something about your technology, so you go into a lot of detail of what the technology is. But also, you want to already do foresight here. What could the technology be like in the future? What are likely or possible future functional products, applications, use cases? This is already something you start looking at here. Then further you want to identify all your stakeholders. You want to be stakeholder driven from the beginning, but along the process you identify more stakeholders and involve them. And also potential impacts, those kind of go hand in hand because many stakeholders are associated with particular impacts. The impact assessment is about both present and future impacts, so that's where the risks come in. But it's not yet about ethics, it's about understanding what the possible futures are of this technology in terms of impacts. So this is where your scenario building comes in, your different kinds of foresight analysis. Having done that, you then go to identification of ethical issues. Having a better understanding of how the technology might evolve, what kinds of impacts it might have in various domains, you can then have a better understanding of the ethical risks. So you start identifying those in step 4. You also go evaluate them. I mean, why are they important? How do they balance against each other? That's a step you make. And then you have a 6th step, which is optional for the assessors. Depends on what the stakeholder who commissions the study wants, is to do recommendations and options for ethical decision making. So, let me go into more detail about 2 of those steps, which are particularly important, which are the impact and foresight analysis, and then also the identification of ethical issues. So, in ethical impact assessment, we do foresight analysis with a time horizon that is usually fine-tuned with the commissioner. So it could be as low as 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. That's a time horizon where you're looking into the future. Depending on preferences, we can focus on more probable futures, plausible futures, possible futures, depending on the kind of scope that you're looking for. And then looking at those futures, we usually begin with a focus on future technology. That is, how might the technology plausibly develop in the future in terms of its functional products, new techniques that enable new kinds of products and processes, different applications in different application domains, different use cases. We do a mapping of those together with technology experts, with experts in social sciences as well, and come to initial assessment of that. And then also the associated impacts. So if you have these particular applications, these use cases, these products, what kinds of impacts, given the contextual knowledge that you have of society, can you expect? So that's what we try to arrive at using various foresight methods, whether it's scenario building, expert panels, visioning, horizon scanning. We usually employ mixed methods, employ several methods at once. Of course, this all depends on budget and time. These are, of course, crucial factors in the methods you can employ. We actually did, in one project, we did several extensive ethical impact assessments of emerging technologies. We did AI, robotics, human genomics, human enhancement, and later also virtual reality, neurotechnology, and sustainable technologies. And so there's a lot of proof of concept for this method because it worked. And these were big budget investigations. So then the other step is identification of ethical issues. Well, for identifying ethical issues, for not doing speculative ethics where you just say, oh, this or that ethical risk may emerge in the future, right? So for nanotechnology, there was this idea, for example, that, oh, in the toekomst we may have gray goo or nanobots that may pollute the planet, or that may nanobots that autonomously take over aspects of reality. Well, that's speculative ethics. You want this to be based on a reliable foresight analysis, and that's what we do. The foresight analysis brings us a better understanding of the possible evolutionary paths of the technology, the possible impacts, and then based on that, it's possible to identify ethical risks. As I will give some examples of how that happens. So let's take a look at how exactly that could happen. Take nanomedicine. So it's a particular branch of nanotechnology. And how can we apply foresight to this? Well, first of all, again, we look at the kinds of products and applications that could emerge in the future. So we look at the technology level, we look at nanomedicine in general, including its current and projected new techniques and subfields. Then we look at the level of technological artifacts and see what kinds of emerging or likely to emerge products you see there, like lab on a chip, drug delivery systems, medical nanorobots, and others. And then from there, we can go to application levels. We can look at the application of such products in particular domains. For example, lab on a chip could be applied in home medicine, but it could also be applied in clinical settings for cancer detection, etc., etc. So mapping that then gives us, that's the first step towards then doing the kind of social impact assessment, and then followed by the actual ethical impact assessment. So take a look, for example, at, so this can be a very extensive analysis where you do that for nanotechnology at large, right? So, and we did it for the whole field of AI. We have like a 200-page report of all the ethical issues that we anticipate, many of which have come true in the meantime for AI. But here I'm just going to give the example of lab on a chip as one of the artifacts that comes out of nanomedicine, and then specifically lab on a chip for home medicine. So you have that application, then you have to start thinking about, okay, what are the possible impacts on users, patients, individuals, institutions. So one possible impact, for example, is, well, directly related to the technology, individuals can monitor health conditions without visiting a clinic using lab on a chip. So this has an immediate ethical benefit, which you can recognize as an ethicist with training. It increases patient autonomy, which is a good thing. But there's also an ethical risk, which is that there's a risk of misdiagnosis by patient, which could result in harms to health. Another possible impact is that this kind of technology almost immediately can be seen to decentralize health infrastructure. So this could have an ethical benefit of more healthcare equity, as people are more locally empowered. But it could also exacerbate inequalities if access to them would require capital or education. So then you immediately also see the kind of barriers that you have to overcome if you want the benefits without the ethical risks. Another example would be in AI. Recently have been studying conversational AI and what I call relational AI, AI that establishes human AI relationships. So that's an upcoming emerging technology. So conversational AI results in many different projects. It results in virtual personal assistants, customer service agents, companionship bots, educational and tutoring agents, and many others. So some of these already exist at a large scale, some of them are kind of emerging at the moment. So these are kind of products coming out of this. And for each of these products, again, you can look at the different applications at the application level, and then do a kind of foresight analysis of impact and possible ethical risks. So at the application level for companionship bots, for example, right? These companionship bots, it's an emerging phenomenon where you can have a virtual friend. So it can actually be a software bot, either just through text or through an avatar, or it can also be a social robot. And some of them are marketed to children, some of them are marketed to young adults or adults for friendship or for having a virtual boyfriend or girlfriend. And so there are various applications here, right? So there's elderly care companions, there's emotional support bots for people going through difficult times. There is bots specifically aimed at romantic companionship. There are cultural companionship bots and various others. So for each of those, again, you can look at what are the implications, what are the different possible scenarios where this might raise particular ethical risks. So here's an example of companionship bot. The company Replica provides virtual avatars, lifelike humans who can be your friend. The AI companion who cares, always here to listen and talk. Of course, enabled by chatbot technology, so conversational AI. So they can talk to you and you can talk back to them. with that? Well, there are some impacts and ethical risks. So one of the impacts, of course, of these bots is that emotional support is provided in different ways to human users. But emotional support can come at a price. Emotional support by a bot can lead to emotional dependency on that bot. It can also lead to possible deception, right? So the parties who kind of offer that bot, maybe they want to deceive the user for commercial or political messaging, for example. There's a risk of misattribution of sentience. People may think that the bot has actual feelings and really cares for you, which I don't think it does. And it can lead to people that really need professional help, that they will not seek it because their bot is taking care of them. So these are all ethical risks that if you do a careful analysis, you can see happening. Another impact is that these bots can actually displace human-human relationships. So they can contribute to a loss of human connection and also a loss of associated social capital. That is, a loss of the kinds of resources you have by having a social network. And they can finally also lead to a changed expectation for human relationships, which means that, well, if these bots, they never fight with us, right? They're always nice to us. They don't cause trouble. Well, perhaps that's something that other humans that we interact with should do too. So it may change your expectations for human relationship. It may distort our relational norms. It may reduce our tolerance for real-world relational complexity. So some things that an ethical analysis combined with foresight can give you. Now we use for this, for the kind of foresight analysis, we use what we call guiding ethically relevant social impact categories of various kinds, personal, social, and natural kinds of impacts and risks. We use a number of guiding ethical principles, like harm principles, justice principles, well-being, and rights principles. But these are all just guiding, because they should never replace an actual, detailed foresight analysis or ethical analysis. So to conclude, once you've done this ethical impact assessment, you have a keen insight in these ethical risks, but then of course you want to do something with that result. You want to maybe issue recommendations for mitigation of these ethical risks, and you want further decision making. For governments, it's in technology policy. For technology developers, it's in responsible innovation. And there's next steps for that is also being provided for in ethical impact assessment, but there are additional methods. For example, I've been involved with developing the method of ethics by design, which is a recommended method for technology developers who maybe have already done the ethical impact assessment for the new product, but now want to incorporate ethical considerations systematically in the design process. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation and that you learned something from it, and I look forward to questions. Thank you.